Hello, everybody. I have a confession, which is that I was supposed to do nominations and a vote for which video I was going to respond to this week, and I didn't do it. Basically, the reason for that is, okay, so look, I'm going to do on my Patreon and Subscribestar little bonus videos a few more things that are just like generic life updates, which is, some people might say it's rambly, but I think it's worth mentioning. And one of those things, which in my view is worth mentioning, is why it is that I might be behind on my production schedule. And I am behind on my production schedule. This video is due to go up in 5 hours and 20 minutes, which is doable, sort of. The interesting thing about this reaction content is that it is quicker and easier to make, but it takes significantly longer to render. So I don't know, we'll see if I get this up on time. I apologize if I don't. What I want to say is that I recently watched a video by the YouTube channel yourmoviesucks.org, and one of the things he was saying is that sometimes, he tries to be good in terms of maintaining a schedule, and then it all falls apart because he is like, oh, I'm working on this video, and if I just get this thing done, then, that would be great. And you basically enter a stage of kind of like last minute grinding, where you don't want to stop working. And then that means that all the other stuff that you would do, and that sounds good, but it means all the other stuff that you would do that you would kind of just keep an eye on and keep ticking over, you don't do. And I'd never felt more seen at all, because that's exactly what I have. Like I try to have a little schedule where I have all of these regular things I want to do to give me a routine, and also to make sure that some of the small stuff doesn't get neglected. But then I have a big thing. So recently, I guess you're thinking, what's the big thing? Well, if you go to my media review channel, Casey Reviews, and I'll see what we're at right now. I can't be bothered, actually. Basically, last I checked, one of my videos on my media review channel is at 80,000 views. So I was like, well, Jiminy Christmas, while I've got a whole load of attention on that channel, I need to make sure that I get out another video soon so that it can bask in the reflected glory of that video doing really well. So basically people who have just seen or are even now going to be watching that video that I'm sure will, like, the views are still climbing. I'm sure it will reach at least 100k, and as such probably be my first video ever on YouTube to do that. And if you're interested in what the video is, go check it out, Casey Reviews. Just subscribe. You should subscribe to my media review channel anyway. So of course, believing that I had to get it out as soon as possible, and believing that I was pretty close to having it finished, I entered a grind, I guess I call it a grind set, over the weekend, where I was just like, I just got to edit this and get that, and, check the recording and, blah, blah, blah. Because of course the media review channel requires a lot more editing. So I was doing that. And the consequence of that is that I completely forgot about all the stuff I was supposed to be doing on Patreon, and I apologize for that. But yeah, absolutely, like, something I always want to do. Sorry, by the way, if you aren't interested in this kind of, like, I'm kind of assuming if you follow me on Patreon or Subscribestar, you are interested enough in me that this kind of stuff, like this is basically just an extra thing. I'm assuming that it's not going to bother you too much, but feel free to let me know. If I will be a little bit upset if you do, but if you really don't like when I just give you little life updates, then let me know, because I don't have to do it. I just want to be friends with you and tell you all about my day. Anyway, so basically, I do have like aspirations of having a strict schedule. And one of the things that you've got to throw into a strict schedule is like strictly scheduled leisure time, because that's one of the things that, like, I wish I was better at. I wish I was better at being like, okay, it's time to stop working now and relax, because of course, if I don't do that, then I get burnt out and things like that. So just everything in terms of, I'm good. I've got a good sleeping pattern. I'll give myself that. Although, of course, that's the other thing. My sleeping pattern's been a little bit off recently because I cut my thumb. This is like the final thing before I get into the video. I almost want to like react to some of the video and then give you this thumb update, but whatever. Just to like, so it's not just front loaded with a whole load of life stuff. The thing about cutting your thumb that I realized is you can damn near cut your thumb open and there can be blood everywhere and blah, blah, blah. And no matter how serious it is, it can hurt like hell. At the end of it all, you're just going to have a little plaster on a not particularly, significant looking digit, right? Like, it hurt a lot. And I haven't really inspected the cut yet because, of course, I wrapped it up and, I didn't want to splay it out, but like it was bleeding profusely. I can say that. Sorry if that makes your legs kind of wobbly. But so it hurt a lot. It was bleeding a lot. And because of that, I, was holding it tight until I got some kind of bandage on it. So I haven't actually ascertained exactly how deep and substantial the cut is. But my belief is that it was probably quite big. What was I doing? Well, I finally did it. I finally did the meme. I was cutting an avocado. I was trying to get the stone out of an avocado with a knife, and it slipped on the phone, went straight into my thumb. Hurt so much. I say it hurts so much. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, though? Because when you actually immediately stab yourself, or like when you do something immediately that causes you pain, it's almost hard to process it as pain. It's always more just like shock to me. It's really difficult for me to think about how much something actually hurts when I've got the immediate shock of having just done it. Because there is that sense of hurt, but then it's like drowned out also by surprise and panic. Because you just, cut yourself. Anyway, so when it really started to hurt in a very unambiguous sense was when the initial shock died down and I was just left with a throbbing, swollen thumb. And that night, I just could not get to sleep because it hurt a lot. And it's quite difficult to relax and go to sleep when you just got like pain, and I couldn't like move my hand into a comfortable position. I had to like just keep it. So yeah, basically that ruined everything. But then last night I recovered like nobody's business. Just sleep at 10:30. Woke up. I gave myself an extra half an hour. I woke up at 7:10. Anyway, okay, that's it. Now we're done. We're actually going to jump into the video. I kind of want to apologize, to be honest. I don't know. We'll see if I end up editing this down, but let's jump into video. So I suppose the one thing I'll just say very quickly is that the upshot of all that complex stuff going on is that I didn't do what I'm supposed to do, which is have a specific time where I make a post saying, hey guys, submit your nominations for what you want me to react to. And I didn't put it to a vote. Fortunately, I did have, from when I initially, when I previously made a comment asking what people would like me to react to, I did get some suggestions, so I'm using those suggestions for this video. But yeah, in the future, I do want to get better at it. I'm really going to try. I'm going to give it my best, my utmost to be better at it. All right, let's jump into this video. Hopefully everything's okay. I can't. So I suppose I should actually say what we're responding to. I'm sorry for not clarifying that or communicating that. So the first video we're going to be responding to is by this channel. I'll tell you the channel name, Dr. Z PhD. Again, this is just to reiterate, this is a small channel because what I'm now doing with this bonus reaction content is reacting to stuff that I wouldn't really see the point in reacting to on my main channel. So, and yeah, this video is called, sorry, I don't know if I said this already, the key difference between gender identity versus gender expression versus gender role. So we're going to learn some language and see what's said. So I guess we're just going to jump in, see how it goes. Okay.
Today, we're going to talk about the differences between gender identity as your core sense of self, gender expression, and gender role, and how the three tend to tango together. It's a very important subject because I see especially younger adults confuse all those three.
Okay, look, I don't know how often I'm going to be pausing this, but I'll say right out the bat, like the saying like, oh, they're all tangled together. The problem with that is you're saying that your innate sense of self is tangled up with your expression, which is basically gender stereotypes, and your role, which is gender stereotypes. So you're saying your innate sense of self is tangled up with gender stereotypes. Now, in some sense, I can understand someone saying that as that's the reality of the situation. But the problem is that the way that trans activists or, kind of theorizers around trans identity, which is what I assume this person is, will say all of this as if it's completely morally neutral and as if it's not a problem. And that's the issue. Like, if your sense of self is incredibly tied up with gender stereotypes, that's something which I don't think we should just talk about in neutral terms. We should talk about as potentially a serious problem.
Gender identity tends to be formed through, as I always say, multitude of things, a lot of things that affect the formation of one's gender identity, including...
Okay, so the big issue so far is that the term gender has not been defined. So it's kind of like, because what she said, I don't know, again, it's a bit awkward with the whole, letting some of it play and embossing it and things like that. This is a problem I remember from, when I used to do this reaction style in the past. Because you want to let the whole point play out, but you also don't want to have the entire video be made up of someone else talking. Basically saying your gender identity is your own sense of identity in relation to gender. But what does gender mean? I feel like for a lot of trans activists, gender just means the categories of man and woman. But then it's like, well, how can you feel anything in relation to those terms if they can't define those terms, or they define those terms in a circular way by saying, well, the way your man and woman is defined is by your gender identity. Well, how can you define gender identity with reference to the categories of man and woman and then define man and woman with reference to gender identity? It's circular.
Internal would be subject to subject and external will be subject to an object. For that reason, identity, your gender identity, is subjective, meaning it is formed through the experiential fields, through the experiences embedded.
So there you go. Your gender identity is subjective. The problem with that is, of course, what subjective means. It doesn't just mean, I think like a lot of people make this mistake of thinking because something is about yourself, it's therefore subjective. But that's not true. There are lots of things about yourself that are objective. For example, you are objectively a human being, I would assume, if you're capable of listening to and understanding this. So that's something where your sense of self in that regard, like if you think you're not a human being and you actually think you're like a dog or something, then you are objectively wrong. So we can actually say, when we're talking about somebody's sense of self, that their sense of self is objectively an incorrect belief. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss because, again, they think, well, subjective means it's your opinion, and your opinion is surely going to be something that's just about yourself. Like they kind of do this weird thing where they kind of get from it's just about you and how you feel, and therefore it's subjective. But that's not always true. There can be things that are about you and how you feel that might relate to that which is objective. I mean, look, if you feel that 2 + 2 = 5, you're still objectively wrong. And of course, the contrast is there are some things which are subjective that are beyond yourself. And again, it's difficult to find things that are uncontroversially subjective. But if I think that it's difficult because I obviously have to use the word I think because, of course, subjective and objective, these are about beliefs. The idea that a painting is beautiful or not, that's not something that the painting is thinking about itself. The painting isn't identifying as beautiful. The painting is rather being identified as beautiful. So that's basically something that's imposed upon the painting, but it is subjective nonetheless. Something being something that you're thinking about yourself doesn't mean it's subjective, and something being thought about by you doesn't mean it's objective.
This creates a level of incredible discomfort between I am this, but yet everybody else sees me through a completely different lens, which I can't even imagine what a mindfuck that has got to be. And I can't believe that cis people can wrap their small heads around it.
It's a bit funny to say, I can't imagine, what that would be like, and then say, I can't imagine that cis people can't wrap their heads around it. Like, you're kind of, well, you're saying you can't imagine it. So the first thing there basically is talking about, having this incongruence, and that must be crazy. The problem is, like, OCD, right? Like, it's just, I saw, so my wife was watching a TV show, reality show on Netflix called Love is Blind, and I kind of got a little bit into it. I don't really watch reality TV, but it was on, and this was when we were in the location in America where I was kind of recording in the main room because there wasn't like a private area for me. So I'd be working on videos or whatever, and it would be on, and sometimes I'd get hooked into it. Anyway, there was quite. I went onto the subreddit for it because I wanted to see what was going on with the drama and stuff. And one of the things someone was commenting on was how this episode or this series seemed to be uniquely bad in terms of having people conflate being tidy with being OCD. And that was definitely true because essentially at one point in the show, there's like different levels of dating. And one of the levels is that they see each other's houses and see how each other are living. And about half of the people basically made a point of how organized and tidy they were, how everything needed to be in the right place, how, they kept everything organized. And they all, every single one of them, categorized that as being OCD. Anyway, and that was a comment from someone that was like, sometimes I believe things are true, even though they're not, but I'm absolutely upset about them. I'm so OCD, ha ha ha. And it was like a joke because, of course, like this was on Reddit, because, of course, people always say, I'm so tidy, I'm so OCD, huh? And the funny thing is that, well, that's not really what being OCD is. What being OCD is having something irrational that you believe. I'm sure there's like a more technical definition for it, but this is pretty much good. And like believing there's things you need to do in order to deal with that. I've never had anyone explain to me how, like, I remember there was a documentary about OCD, and one of the things was just this woman who was absolutely convinced that she'd murdered someone. She was just 100% convinced that she'd done that. And obviously that's something which must be really difficult to believe that about yourself and just be absolutely convinced that's true, despite, I guess, on some level knowing, like, rationally it's not true, but just having a sense of like, no, I'm sure I've done it, makes sense. It's so hard for me not to think that trans identity or gender dysphoria is exactly like that. It's this absolute certainty that something is wrong. That you should have actually been a man, or you should have actually been a woman, and it's a mistake that things are the way they are, and you need to do all this stuff to basically fix that. That sounds like textbook OCD. So I completely agree that this would be a mind fuck. I don't usually swear. But yeah, I can completely agree with that. But my question is, does that sound to anyone like it makes the gender dysphoria is therefore a good basis for affirming trans identity? I wouldn't think so. And that's kind of, the point about like cis people can't wrap their heads around it. Well, it is a difficult thing to wrap your head around, like believing something that's obviously not true. But it's not too difficult to apprehend what's being explained. And with that in mind, the question, or the thing that I think cis people, if anything, can't wrap their heads around, is that why does that mean your trans identity is valid? The other thing, of course, I should point out here is that not all so-called trans people have gender dysphoria, and of course, not all people with gender dysphoria are going to be trans. Some of them might be non-trans or cis. So, what that would be is someone who has gender dysphoria, who has that kind of OCD-like feeling that them being a man or them being a woman is wrong and something else instead should be the case. But they resist that, and they realize that it's probably healthier for them to basically force themselves to recognize reality and, kind of exposure therapy and all that kind of stuff. All right.
I am comfortable as a woman. I don't find myself, even though I gender bend all the time, I don't find myself necessarily as my core identity is gender queer.
Yep. See, and then like you add this other stuff into it of like, oh, it doesn't even have to be the categories of man and woman. And of course, it can be completely unrelated to gender bending. The issue is when you get into this idea of it being fluid, I just don't really know what you're talking about. I suppose what I should really admit is on some level, I just don't get this whole gender identity thing in terms of it being possible to conceive of it as anything other than akin to a mental illness, right? Like if I thought that I was black and I really believed I was black, and maybe even I was like fluid and like sometimes I thought I was black, sometimes I didn't, you wouldn't hesitate to think that must be some kind of mental illness. Same for age or like anything else, species. So why do we make this massive exception for the categories of man and woman? That's sort of my question. I've never heard an explanation of how this idea of gender identity or gender fluidity makes sense.
Imagine if your spine was something that is a foundation that holds you whole being together. My foundation is feminine, so I strongly identify to it. So for me, it's
see this again. This like it's a very anti-feminist notion, definitely, to suggest like my whole foundation is being feminine, which, well, I thought feminine was about like gender expression, but whatever. That's the other aspect. It's like this quite unhealthy attitude towards the categories of man and woman, that this is something that matters to you so much. Again, like for me, if you say I'm a woman, you're just being inaccurate. Like that's kind of the funny thing about the whole gender identity thing. It's supposed to be that you are actually, let's take the example of a trans-identified male, you're supposed to be a woman. That's what you think you are. But if you actually thought you were a woman, wouldn't you just treat that as a fact? But they don't treat it as a fact. They treat it as like a faith. For me, I think I'm a man. In fact, I more than think I'm a man. I know I'm a man. But if you don't think I'm a man, well, I just think, okay, that's weird. You're wrong. Like, obviously I'm a man. The problem is with trans-identified people, it's like, I'm a woman. And then if someone disagrees, it's not just like, well, you're wrong because like factually I am, because of course they can't say that because factually there's no indication they are. Instead, they have to say you're bigot, you're evil. They have to respond in an emotional way. They say facts don't care about feelings. Well, I'm a man and that's a fact. So I don't care about like feelings don't really interface with it at all. The problem is with trans identity, it's clear there are a lot of feelings going on, even from what we've heard here. It's like, this anguish and all that kind of stuff. This is not the kind of stuff you would expect to see if trans identity was simply an expression of a fact. It sounds much more like it's an expression of a feeling.
The reason why gender tends to shift is because we shift as human beings as we go through life.
Yeah, okay, but what is it actually about us as human beings that relates to the categories of man and woman? And like, how are you defining man or woman such that any shift could meaningfully relate to that? Like, man has to be defined by something. So what I would say, for me, man means biological sex. And since my biological sex isn't going to change, I will always be a man. But like, okay, maybe you could say, well, man is about masculinity. Well, that would change. That changes all the time, really. Like, I might be more masculine in one moment and less masculine in the next. I mean, I'm more or less masculine depending on what I wear, I guess. I mean, right now I'm wearing black. Maybe that's a bit more masculine than what I could be wearing. I mean, I'm wearing red underneath. Maybe red's a bit more of a feminine color because it's close to pink. The issue is, one, I think that's a stupid way of doing things anyway. But the other issue is, well, the whole point of this is that gender identity is different from gender expressions and gender roles. So you've blocked yourself off. Like, obviously, I think it would be kind of stupid to define man with reference to masculinity, but at least that makes sense. At least I can understand what you're saying. At least, like, it actually means something. But when you talk about, well, I change and my gender identity changes with that, and your gender identity is nothing? Like, what is your gender identity? That's the issue that always comes down to. And people, like, even in videos that explain it, you can have it explained to you and you can just pause like I'm doing and just ask, every other second. Yeah, but what is gender identity, right? Because it's not being defined with reference to anything meaningful.
As you know, you're not static. As you already noticed, your personality has evolved, your character, your temperament.
Yeah, of course. The thing is, all of that is like stuff that's just about me, and it doesn't affect what demographic I belong to. Like, that's the issue. To say there is a particular mentality or temperament that makes you a man or woman is a problem, right? Because, well, then doesn't that kind of put you halfway down the road to justifying basically treating men and women differently, as if they have basically different mental capabilities and different kind of mental inclinations? So you could start saying, oh, women are irrational, so they shouldn't be allowed to vote. Men are violent, so they shouldn't be allowed to do, X, Y, Z thing. But then, of course, you could say, well, no, we're not defining it like that. But then the question is, well, how are you defining it? Because, of course, it's always the bait and switch kind of thing where they appeal to this idea of personality and temperament to give substance to the idea of being a man or woman. But then, of course, when you actually try to interrogate, well, what specific aspects of personality and temperament are you talking about? They have to say, well, nothing really, because, of course, they said anything concrete, they would then be saying something tremendously sexist and regressive. So then, yeah, basically they have to say they're not saying anything substantial, which puts us back to square one.
Has also evolved. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. Sure, there's things in you that probably maintain the same, but there's a lot of things that are very different. I know that I'm an incredibly different woman today than I was even a week ago.
Yeah, see, I think the other issue here, and I pointed this out before, is that there seems to be this idea that trans identity is in some ways celebrating diversity. It's really not. It's more significant if you celebrate, like, diversity only matters if it's diversity within a particular group, right? Like, this is the analogy I've always made with reference to the UK. Okay, the UK is a diverse country. Now, why does that mean something? Well, it means something because to be part of the UK means something. But really, it would mean, if we're talking about the UK as a country being diverse, it means living in the UK most of the time. Obviously not just being a visitor, really, that probably wouldn't be considered part of diversity if you're just a tourist. Although I do like those things where, like, people will go around Paris or London and they'll take a picture and, like, it will be loads of foreign people. And it's like, look, obviously Paris and London do have a large non-white population that lives there, but it's also worth noting that Paris and London are filled with tourists. I mean, the perception you would get if you went to London, like the center of London, is that the UK is massively filled with East Asian people. Whereas in reality, the UK doesn't have a particularly large East Asian population at all, but it does have East Asian people who want to visit London, because, of course, who wouldn't want to visit London? It's one of, like, the most iconic cities in the world, so lots of people are going to want to visit it. It's a funny situation. Anyway, sorry, that was just a little bit of a tangent. But what I did want to say is that, if we're actually talking about what it means for the UK to be diverse, it has to be the case we're talking about people who, in some sense, live in the UK. So here's the problem. What if we then redefine the concept of living in the UK to mean nothing? Well, now, saying that the UK is diverse doesn't mean anything, because it's like, well, okay, that could mean that somebody in, China or wherever, Outer Mongolia, who's never been to the UK in their life, is now considered part of the diversity of the UK, because we've completely made it so being associated with the UK is no longer actually relevant. And it's the same thing with women, right? Like, if women are tall or short or blah, 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 or, like, have all sorts of different attributes, that means something because there is one specific thing that makes all those people women. And because all those people are women, it's significant that while they're all women, they have all this diversity in all these other ways. The problem is, if the word woman doesn't mean anything, then them being diverse in all those other ways also doesn't mean anything. Because it's like, well, of course, this group that's not defined by anything is diverse. There's nothing they all have in common. That's the problem. Yeah, so this idea that trans identity is celebrating diversity is nonsense. Because in order for diversity to mean anything, there has to be something, like if you're saying a population is diverse, there has to be something that defines that population to be worth referencing in the first place. Otherwise, well, of course they're diverse, right? It's such an obvious point. When I did like geography case studies at school, and you'd go out to a pond and you'd look at, I don't know, the different varieties of frogs that are by that pond, and you'd record them. If you show that the variety of frogs by the pond is very diverse, that's significant. If you show up and you say, yeah, actually there was a lot of diversity of the frogs at the pond, because there were some that were like flat, leafy, green things. There were some that was like cakey, brown, mud, and like, so like basically defining all these things that clearly aren't frogs. Or you say, for example, there were some that were like brightly colored Amazonian dart frogs. Sorry, I really struggled with that sentence there. Well, the problem is you're then going to get your geography teacher saying, a lot of these things you've listed here aren't frogs, and I don't think they would have been by the pond. Right? Like, oh yeah, there's a lot of diversity in the frogs by the pond. One of them is the President of the United States. No, that's not true. And of course, you would probably then get a very low mark in your grade, because the point was to document the diversity. And documenting the diversity, like I say, I admit sometimes I label points, only means something if there's something that all the things that you're documenting the diversity in have something in common.
For that reason, your orientation and your relationship to gender is also going to shift. That's just natural and normal to happen. I can't imagine why so many people struggle to realize why would that even occur.
Again, everybody recognizes that there are changes that happen in somebody's life, and those changes will have an effect on them. Nobody is confused about that point. People are wondering, well, how does that mean that you become a man or a woman? It's like the people who think like you ask them, hey, why should we redefine the term man or woman? And they say, well, words change all the time. It's like, yeah, sure. But again, I can't eat a beef burger, claim I'm a vegan, and then say, well, are you not aware that words change? And here I could say, I could eat a beef burger, claim I'm a vegan, and say, well, sometimes I'm eating beef, sometimes I'm not. But, my identity as a vegan is fluid, independent of that. And how can you struggle with this idea that, people will do different things, and those things will affect how they feel about themselves? No, the point isn't, the question isn't, do people do things and do those things affect how they feel about themselves? The question is, can you be a vegan while eating a beef burger? No.
Your expression could be in complete alignment to your gender, or it could be in complete disalignment to your gender. This is incredibly...
So look, I think gender expression, we all kind of get what it is. It's masculinity, femininity. The problem with gender expression makes complete sense. I can completely understand the idea that somebody would dress a particular way. Obviously, there is complexity to it. It varies from culture. It varies in time period. It perhaps even varies in terms of how you conceive of what you're doing. For example, I think it's possible that a man and a woman might do, or a masculine person and a feminine person might do the exact same thing, but they might think about it in different senses. So yeah, of course there's complexity to gender expression. We'll see if anything's said that's particularly important to respond to, but my main feeling about gender expression is, yes, gender expression makes sense as a concept. It's worth talking about. It's worth talking about the reality of masculinity and femininity existing, but the big question is, how does that relate to gender identity?
You can be trans masculine person in regard to your core gender identity and have a feminine gender expression. You can also be a woman in regards to your gender identity and have a non-binary gender expression. I want you to notice how your gender expression...
I would say this, I think the use of the term non-binary to mean a gender expression, I think it's I don't know how I feel about that, because at the end of the day, I think that's one of the other problems. I think with this term non-binary gender expression, it's kind of assuming that there is a binary of gender expression, which I don't really agree with. I would say that, that's kind of the funny thing about the whole term non-binary. The non-binary implies a binary. And usually I think that's kind of funny when it comes to the categories of man and woman, because there I think there actually is a binary. But in the case of gender expression, it bothers me because, well, there isn't a binary. So everybody's kind of non-binary. Like, sure, I'm masculine, but like, it's not as if there's like this one guide on how to be a man and I'm like completely subscribing to that. No. It's the thing is, it's not a spectrum either. What it is just a massive variety of different options. And I suppose you could say, well, it's a binary and that you can broadly categorize it into masculine and feminine, but it's a binary in a much less significant sense than, for example, biological sex is a binary. Because, you know, for example, what might be considered masculine at one point could have been considered feminine in the past. Like I say, it varies so much that, like, that's why I think for me, when people say I'm non-binary, it's a meaningless thing to say because it's basically just them choosing to categorize themselves that way. And anyone could claim to be non-binary, right? I mean, the big thing about non-binary, and I made a joke about this before, is that it's often, especially amongst women, just about hair. You know, if a woman cuts her hair short, she can credibly claim to be non-binary. But it's like, lots of women cut their hair short and don't make that claim. So, like, that's the issue, I guess.
The key question is, are you comfortable how you see yourself on the inside? I can a lot of times have...
Yeah, and like that's another thing that kind of like makes no sense. Like, you ever seen like the memes where it's like how I look with he, him in my bio, and it's like someone who looks like so much like a woman, it's insane. Because obviously I recognize someone can be he, him, and look feminine if someone's a biological male who looks feminine. Of course that makes sense. But the issue is people who claim to be men based on their gender identity, and then not even their gender expression lines up with that. At that point, you're being ridiculous. You're making a kind of mockery out of the whole English language. I mean, like, the thing is, I respect it in a way as like a way to show everyone how nonsense trans identity is. And of course, there are like the true trans who rightly get annoyed about it because it makes no sense at all. But yeah, like, I feel like saying, well, I deeply feel that I'm a man, or let's say I deeply feel I'm a woman, even though I'm biologically male, and then I don't even express as a woman, or like I don't express in a feminine way. That's ridiculous. How can I claim that I deeply feel I'm a woman? It just like, it makes gender identity an even more nonsense claim when it doesn't even relate to sexist stereotypes, because at least if it related to sexist stereotypes, it would relate to something.
External matters so much. You know how a lot of people say, oh, why don't you just accept your body, and why don't you just love your body that you're born with, accepted? Why you struggle so much? Why do you have to go through gender transition to modify yourself? Just accept who you are, and fine, if you think you're transgender, just think that you're transgender. Well, the reason why it matters so much to transgender individuals is because there's such a strong internal disalignment to begin with their gender assigned at birth.
The issue there is that, of course, the perspective of someone who's asking these questions, why does it matter, is someone who doesn't get, and I would argue rightly doesn't get, because I don't think it makes any sense, this idea that your internal sense is something that is actually, you should actually influence you to behave a certain way or influence how you feel. That's the main issue, right? So just saying, well, because the internal sense of disalignment is there, well, yeah, the question is, I don't deny that, but why should you listen to it? Why shouldn't you just be comfortable? Like, my feeling would be that the internal sense of disalignment is there because you have internalized a lot of ideas about masculinity and femininity, and that, you know, the relation of that to man and woman. And the solution there is to, you know, overcome that internalized anxiety by realizing it doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman. What matters is feeling comfortable with who you are. And that means basically not feeling the need to lie about reality. Like, that's the problem. If you feel the need to lie about reality, you're not comfortable with who you are. You wouldn't, if someone had like something they were really anxious about, and like, you know, like someone who's really anxious about flying, for example, because I'm anxious about flying. if I said, yeah, I've actually completely gotten over my anxiety around flying, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, great. Well done. You know, that sounds like real progress. I'm like, yeah, I've actually really gotten over it because I've realized that actually, you know, planes don't exist. And it actually turns out that the government's just tricking us into thinking planes are a thing, when really it's just trains, and we don't actually go off the ground or anything. You know, there's no reason to get anxious about being tens of thousands of feet in the air. If I said that, you'd be like, well, no, hold on a minute. No, planes do exist. Like, and when you ride on a plane, you are actually tens of thousands of feet in the air. And of course, the other thing you would say is the fact that you're feeling the need to deny this reality is an indication that you haven't actually got over the anxiety. And that's generally a good rule. If someone feels the need to deny reality, they probably haven't got over whatever they're anxious about. So if someone has anxieties about the categories of man or woman, and then they start saying, despite being a biological male, well, I've gotten over those anxieties because I've realized I'm a woman, you would say, well, it sounds like you haven't gotten over those anxieties, because otherwise you would accept reality as it is.
And when society first perceives and validates them based on their authentic gender, it becomes, the word I'm looking for, it becomes invaluable. Not that you need validation from anybody else, but because for your psyche to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of presence.
Okay, look, this is another weird thing to say like, well, they need to do this because it makes them feel really happy to be validated. The problem with that is lots of people aren't going to validate you, right? So to say, well, they only do this, the only reason they do this is so that people will accept them as they are, or accept them as they want to be seen. Well, in that case, shouldn't they be finding a strategy? Like, if that was their logic, shouldn't they be looking for something that will encourage more people to accept them as they are? And what would probably encourage most people to accept them is if they stopped lying about reality and said, hey, I'm a feminine man, instead of saying, oh, I'm a trans woman. If they said, hey, I'm a feminine man, I would accept them as they are. Lots of people would accept them as they are. The only people who probably wouldn't accept them as they are like the still hardcore conservatives. But that's the thing. If the goal is to maximize your happiness by having most people accept you, then directly lying about something and forcing anyone who wants to be intellectually honest to now not accept you would seem to run contrary to that goal.
That your gender role does not have to be in alignment with your core gender identity. It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
So I think we're going to end up repeating a lot of stuff here with the gender role situation. So we'll let it play out, but don't be too surprised if I don't have anything to say.
This is why for centuries, so many people rebel against those things. So many designers, fashion designers, for example, constantly rebel against gender expressive norms when they design clothes. Coco Chanel, right? The designer who invented put women in pants.
It's a really bad look when your main argument for how this is a valuable thing when it comes to gender and stuff like that is the fashion industry, considering all the very legitimate criticisms that could be made of the fashion industry. Also, considering you got what companies like Balenciaga are doing and the other kind of norms that a lot of these fashion companies are trying to break down when it comes to the way they're dressing up their child models. I don't know if this is an association you really want to be appealing to as a massive positive,
Any man who just wears a pink sweater, a pink shirt, and gets into a group with a lot of men, I guarantee you there is going to be at least one of his peers that are going to start thinking, this is probably a gay man. This is probably a feminine man. This is probably, and they're going to
So yeah, again, you're pointing out a lot of people have these reductive ideas where they assume just because you're dressing a particular way, that means that that means something's true about you, about your identity that's on the surface unrelated to your gender expression, your fashion, things like that. The problem is that's something you're perpetuating. Or it's the thing is, again, it's not because you're saying, well, gender identity doesn't mean anything. It's got nothing to do with gender expression. The problem is people are naturally going to want to make gender identity make sense. And the first thing they're going to do is think, well, it's got to be about gender expression. That's the problem. Most people can't actually sincerely hold to, even the people I think who claim to, most people can't sincerely hold to this idea that the categories of man and woman, which we recognize are important, are in fact actually describing nothing at all. Which is, if you're going to say, well, the categories of man or woman are just about your gender identity, which is whether you feel you're a man or woman, and you're a man or you get stuck in that circular situation. you are saying that the categories of man and woman in effect mean nothing. And of course, when you listen to what trans-identified people say or trans activists say, they say, well, trans women live lives as women. Well, what does that mean? That means that they present as a woman. Like, basically, lots of the arguments for trans identity are basically that there is some sociological truth to trans identity. And that can only possibly be true if you're talking about the way that trans-identified individuals present themselves in society. That's the issue.
I see a lot of overlap. I see a lot of people who think, oh my God, my gender identity is, feminine, so I got to express it as a woman. I see a lot of these people who are just starting out to transition. I see a lot of trans women who tell me, now I got to give up enjoying Metallica and I got to give up riding my motorcycles. And I'm like, no, please.
Oh, look, see, the fact you're admitting that's something people say, like, okay, cool, you're saying no, but like the fact you're admitting that's something that a lot of people say to you is already like a bit of an admission, right? Like, you're admitting that a lot of people, when they first hear about trans identity, their first thought is, oh, so that means that, like, basically they've got to perform gender stereotypes. And of course, that's not surprising because that's how a lot of trans activists do talk about it. Except for in this specific context where they're clarifying the difference. But otherwise, when they're just talking about trans identity in general, they will always say things about like how trans identified people present as XYZ gender. Yeah.
My mom is still very traditionally in terms of gender roles, and sometimes she'll visit and I'll be drinking a beer out of a bottle, and her comment is always the same: "You drink like a man," and I just love it.
Ding, 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 ding. I don't know, look, I don't know, but it's just really funny how so often these people who talk about trans identity, they'll always admit that they had a parent who's very traditional, and even when they'll say, oh, it's not about gender stereotypes, this isn't just about traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity. These people who advocate for trans identity, it is surprising or it's not surprising at this point, how often they'll admit, oh, and I had this parent who has these really conservative, strict ideas about gender roles. Big surprise.
Smile at her and I say, yes, I love it. I love sometimes to get into the behaviors that we stereotypically consider as masculine, when in reality it's really not. You're just drinking beer in a particular way.
Okay, look, so I guess we're going to pause there because we're pretty much at the end. I think I'll probably call it quits for now. One of the reasons being that I thought, like, I started recording this just before lunchtime, but because I was like, well, I don't want to wait until lunch and then record. So I was like, well, I should record before lunch, but of course that means I'm now having kind of a late lunch. So I think I'll go get my lunch. And while I could have also based on the fact I think this is probably going to be relatively short when I edit it down, I might as well, have a short one, seeing as, like I say, I didn't quite do what I was supposed to do this week, and I do apologize for that, but I did get this video up, and that's the most important thing. So I will make sure over the coming week to actually do the Patreon thing the way that I'm supposed to. So, I'll put out a post for nominations of videos you'd like me to respond to. I'll do the vote. I'll do all of that stuff. Hopefully, again, it's a matter of kind of getting into the habit of it. But yeah, obviously, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that it